Too long a time, actually. I have to disappoint you, so I thought we'd talk about something else apart from that. And I thought what I'd talk about, and this is very much off the top of the head, and if I stop in the middle and give up, it's because you'll gather that I've got a slight cold and sort of croaking here, metaphorically, not literally, or literally rather than metaphorically, I suppose I should say. I thought I'd talk a little bit about why I'm in the Labour Party, why I'm on the left of politics, why I'm a social democrat, why, when I was a young man, I used to use the dreaded word socialist, and then we started saying democratic socialist, and then we thought social democrat was actually slightly better than that, and so it goes on. And I think at heart I've always argued there's one very simple united principle for those of us who see ourselves as social democrats. There are lots of other things, but there's one very simple guiding principle, and that is at the heart of the matter. We believe in the essential equality of human beings. Now, we don't believe that there is any kind of natural hierarchy. We don't believe that intrinsically one person is better than another. One person may be better at athletics or better at chess or better at whatever it may be. But that of itself is not an intrinsic worth. Worth intrinsically attaches to the person as a person. And we should treat people on that essential basis, that they are of equal standing, of equal worth in society. And one of the reasons why I think that fundamental belief stands us in good stead is that it tends to lead you to a whole set of further conclusions. And those conclusions to some extent change over time because the context in which we operate that kind of assumption tends to change over time. Initially, when people were arguing for universal suffrage, what they meant by that was 50% universal suffrage. In other words, one man, and they meant man, one vote. That idea became to seem increasingly quaint as time moved on, and now we regard that essential equality as covering both men and women. It provides a sound basis on which one attacks issues relating, for example, to the place of different racial or ethnic groups within a society. One starts on that fundamental principle, which leads you to a fundamental principle of respect for people's different views of life, and how one can then try to work a society which does recognise those different views. And of course that then itself creates further difficulties. If some people's views of life is that it's perfectly appropriate to discriminate against, to oppress others, at what point in a social democratic society does the state intervene and say, well, actually, no, that may be your view, but that view is not one which is going to be allowed to actually operate. And clearly, for example, that's been a very strong position or issue around people who are homosexual, where many people are, well, my view is I have the right to discriminate against homosexuals. One reverts to the fundamental principle of social democracy, which is the essential equality of people, their right to be respected for who they are. And at that point, the right of the individual homosexual to be respected for who they are trumps the right of bigoted heterosexuals to discriminate against them. And one has to make those kinds of choices as one moves through the sort of hierarchy, if one likes, the way in which those principles develop through. I think the second thing, however, which has become more important as time's gone on in terms of social democratic attitudes is a development around the fact that we take a longer term view of life. We think that we are here for a longer term view of the role of humanity, if you like, and to protect the rights of those who follow on behind us. And I think this has become more important over more recent decades. The right increasingly has become, interesting enough because this is not the historical positioning of the right wing, the right increasingly has become a group of people who tend to take a very short-term view of what issues are. And I think you can see that quite clearly as politicians hate feedback. You can see quite clearly that issue in issues like, for example, the issue of global change, of climate change, where the right has a default tendency to denial because it doesn't really want to think about 50 to 100 years' time. it's worried about the next 5 to 10 years. And you notice that the present discussion around the emissions trading scheme, where the right's position is, yes, we think there is climate change. It's taken a long time to get to that position. But we don't want to do anything which will make people really have to change behaviour, which will have any negative impact on anybody, which might reduce any company's profit over the short term. So there must be no short-term negative impact in relation to a long-term gain, which is necessary for the interests of humanity moving forward, not in the interests of the planet. Occasionally one hears people say that this is an issue of saving the planet. I think that's extraordinarily anthropocentric. I'm afraid the planet will survive quite well if global warming adds 4 or 5 degrees Celsius. The average temperature of the world has been through that before and survived quite happily. What will have trouble surviving is all sorts of species, including some of us, living in low-lying areas, and we'll have to engage in some very difficult adjustments if that is what occurs, and it will threaten international stability. It will create enormous international tensions with the ability for major international conflicts. If you're sitting in Bangladesh with potentially, by the end of the century, a third of your current population underwater, and that's exactly the situation that Bangladesh is in, then that's a pretty scary prospect. You're sitting next door in India, for example, and the tensions around those kinds of things are likely to cause distinct difficulties moving forward. Whereas what we say is, well, actually we do have to think about those longer term issues, that they are increasingly important. And we tended to add on, if you like, to that fundamentally human-centred social democracy, because that is our intellectual roots. The intellectual roots of the social democratic and the left movement generally is about people and about the interactions between people. We've tended to add on to that over time an increasing concern for a range of issues where in fact we are, if you like, the guilty party or the threat rather than the beneficiaries. So an increasing concern about environmental issues, but still a point of difference with our friends who are slightly over the way, which is that if it comes to the crunch, not to mention certain kinds of snails, but if it comes to the crunch, then at the end of the day we will tend to place some greater weight upon the human interest rather than the interest perhaps of some other species. We'll try to balance those interests rather than to say that humanity has to continually give way in face of other demands upon it. So social democracy is, I think, a set of guiding principles which are able to be applied to quite different circumstances over time and provide a guide to action, no more than a guide. The difficulty in practice, of course, for a social democratic government, particularly in the current political framework, where such a government as ours has to negotiate and work with a whole range of other political movements who aren't necessarily entirely in tune with our fundamental principles in that respect, is of course you've got to translate that into practical politics. And the problem always therefore for a social democratic party like the Labour Party is that some people may set standards for social democratic behaviour which can't be actually delivered upon in the political environment, and if they are, maybe at the cost of continuing to be a social democratic environment. And always one of the tensions therefore for our kind of political party and our kind of political movement is what is that trade-off between political necessity and the desire to remain in government in pursuit of the larger interests of social democracy. Now that's not an unusual